as the world teeters on the brink of a war throughout the world. It's not necessarily a world war, although the Russian Navy is now in the firing line of the US Armada, that big, beautiful armada that Donald Trump has sent to the Persian Gulf, which must have particularly acute feelings for my next guest, Trita Parsi. As I said, is Iranian born, but he's a very dispassionate, scientific analyst of events in the Gulf and elsewhere. And I'm glad to say he joins us now. Vice President of the Quincy Institute. Trita, welcome for the first time to the mother of all talk shows. The situation could scarcely be
once before. Yeah. I've been with you once before, I think, but it was
on the mother of all talk shows.
Yeah, I believe so.
Wow, my sincere apologies. And such a handsome face, how could I have forgotten it? Must have been on the radio, Trita. But the situation could scarcely be more grave, could it? How are you viewing it?
I see it as tremendously grave, and I see it as such not only because I think war would be devastating, that I think that there's a significant risk of civil war inside of Iran following that, but also because the incentive structure for both sides now appear to be in favor of some form of escalation. From the US side, of course, the administration believes that their overwhelming force benefits them, and that using it, or at least threatening it, will eventually cause the Iranians to capitulate. I've seen zero evidence for that so far. I don't think that's going to change. But also from the Iranian side, they, I think, correctly recognize that Trump seems to have an exaggerated view of how much relative power Iran has lost, and as a result thinks that capitulation is in the cards, and believe that Iran, though much weaker than the US, obviously has one advantage, which is that Trump's pain tolerance is much lower. And that if there is a confrontation between the two sides that is very intense, and the Iranians strike at the US very, very hard, that this could cause President Trump to back off because he is looking for quick victories. This would not be a quick victory. And the Iranians don't have to win the war. They just need to make sure that they destroy Trump's presidency before they lose the war, which is a very different proposition. That doesn't mean that they won't take huge hits. They clearly will. But I think at this point, they don't believe that they have any way out of this. And this is then leading to a scenario in which the likelihood of war is just going up. These talks that were held in Geneva yesterday, I think, I won't say that they're theatrics, but it doesn't seem as if from the US side there was really a genuine approach towards diplomacy. They go there with essentially capitulation offer, and they want to check in on the Iranians to see if the Iranians are ready to capitulate, given how much military power the US has amassed. And if not, let's meet again in 2 weeks and see if you're ready by then. Rather than an actual negotiations in which the two sides exchange offers, ideas, proposals, etc. As I understand it from what I heard from the talks, the proposals came from the Iranian side, not from the US side. The US was essentially only offering terms of capitulation, and that was not something that the Iranians were going to accept.
Trita, isn't it the case that the US is refusing to take yes for an answer? They said it was about nuclear, and the Iranians have said yes about nuclear. They've said you can have inspections to guarantee that we are not developing a nuclear weapon. And that's not enough for Donald Trump. A new JCPO is not enough for Donald Trump. The capitulation terms that you refer to or allude to are that Iran should make itself defenseless, that it should have no missile capability, even though its adversaries all have missile capability, that it should break its relations with all of its friends and allies across the Arab and indeed Muslim world. These are negotiating tactics that are designed to fail, aren't they?
Yes and no. I think, first of all, you're quite right that when it comes to demands on missiles and other things. I mean, it's really just capitulation at the end of the day. You're absolutely correct about that. And there's a reason why the Iranians are not saying yes to that, obviously. If they were to give up their missiles at this point, that would be the last deterrence that they have against Israel. Hezbollah has been much weakened. Many of these other organizations have been much weakened. They tended to form a first line of defense for the Iranians. It's now more or less gone. Without the missiles, the Iranians have no ability to strike back at Israel. And the Israelis are very worried about the missiles precisely because it limits Israel's maneuverability in the region. It challenges Israel's desire for domination and hegemony. So, but without them, then Iran would turn into what Syria was. As soon as Assad was on a plane to Moscow, the Israelis started bombing everything in Syria to make sure that the next regime would have no capacity whatsoever to pose any challenge to Israel's domination and hegemony. But even on the nuclear issue, because as I understand that these talks actually did focus almost exclusively on the nuclear issue, the position there too has been now something that goes well beyond what is necessary in order for the US to achieve its interests. If its interest is defined as no nuclear weapon, that's fine. But that is not what's being asked for. Essentially is giving up a complete, all elements of the nuclear program, not even in return for sanctions relief, but in return for no new sanctions. But reality is there's hardly any new sanctions that could be imposed at this point. So even when it is reduced to the nuclear variable, which should be resolvable if there is an approach that is based on what Trump talked about earlier on and what he still talks about, which is no nuclear weapon, you actually can find ways to be able to meet both sides' interest on that, but not if it is combined with some sort of an exaggerated maximalist approach, which appears to be what is taking place right now. And that goes back to the core of your issue. Is this just done in order to have an excuse to go to war? I think for those who have been pushing variables such as missiles, etc., yes, those are poison pills from the Israelis. They want these talks to collapse. I don't think Trump wants the talks to collapse. I think, however, Trump only sees capitulation as the acceptable outcome for him. So he's going for capitulation. And when the Iranians say no, he just moved more military assets there in the hope that that will convince them. I don't think it will. And in Trump's mind, perhaps he's doing this to avoid war, but he's only increasing the likelihood of war.
Well, I mean, of course, Trump's art of the deal does include browbeating and even bludgeoning and threatening. But it's gone beyond the art of the deal now. The proportion of U.S. armed force that is now in the Gulf, and the word that I got today from an impeccable source, someone who definitely is in a position to know, the decision is made and the action is imminent. And therefore that begs the question, as some of our callers, actually from the Gulf, have just been asking me, why doesn't Iran preemptively strike the armada that is up against them, and which is clearly, under international law, a clear and present danger and threat to them? Mightn't their military position be enhanced by firing the first shot?
Yes, but only in a scenario in which they have concluded that war is completely unavoidable. Because if they start a war, then they will have a war. But if they still believe that war is avoidable, and clearly their preference is not to have a war, only in that scenario would it potentially make sense. But it would also change dynamics in various ways. If the Iranians are the ones attacking, what will that do to the likelihood of a couple of weeks of warfare actually leading to Trump backing down? I mean, the whole premise of them thinking that they will gain something out of a potential confrontation if they have to, is that by making it as costly as possible for Trump, they will convince him to back down. But if they're the ones who are firing the first shot, does that change that equation? Does it change the psychology on the American side, in which backing off becomes an absolutely non-option for the Americans if they were the ones that were attacked? even though, of course, they were amassing to attack themselves. So I think there's a lot of different factors that come into play here. The military advantage one is only one of those factors. There's psychological factors that come into play, there are political factors that come into play, as well as what that does to the relations with some of the GCC states. At the end of the day, the Iranians have invested heavily in trying to improve relations with Saudi Arabia and with many of their neighbors. They're already risking a lot of that if they start attacking facilities in the GCC, whether it is American bases or whether it is civilian oil installations. But on top of that, if they're the ones who are actually starting the war, what does that do to the psychology of some of their neighbors that so far they've not been on Iran's side, but they've been on the side of avoiding war?
And of course, it would affect their relations with the two superpower allies that they have, one of which, Russia, is currently engaged in naval exercises with the Iranian Navy. I refer, of course, to Russia. And China also has vital interests in Iran and vital interests in the preservation of the Iranian state, the avoiding of balkanization, the avoiding of the civil war you alluded to earlier. Russia and China might well be affected by a preemptive retaliation by Iran. But as I'm talking about them, if the war begins, if you will allow that hypothesis, what will the attitude of Russia and China be?
Well, I think we saw that in Venezuela, the Russians and the Chinese were taken by surprise, and their response was very, very muted. I've spoken to officials from those countries who say that they will not have the same response if this same thing, more or less in some variation, is repeated with Iran. But at the same time, I have a very hard time seeing that the Russians, for instance, would do anything particularly impactful, because what is at the core of their interest is to end the war in Ukraine and find some way of making a deal. And they believe that with Trump, they have the best chance of doing so. They're not going to sacrifice that in order to assist the Iranians. Same thing with the Chinese. They have their own interests at heart, of course. And as much as they don't want to see the balkanization of Iran or that instability, they're very worried about it. It does not mean that that is a core interest of theirs at this point that would compel them to sacrifice other interests that they have. They see themselves already on a pathway towards some form of a confrontation with the United States, hopefully not a military one. Not one that they want, by the way, and they don't want to do anything that increases the risk of that either. But what would happen to Iran would be costly to the Chinese. They're getting a significant amount of their oil from Iran. Not that it's irreplaceable, but nevertheless, this will be costly. And it will be particularly costly if the United States is using this strategy to slowly but surely take control over more and more of the providers of oil to China, and by that gain a significant amount of leverage over the Chinese. Now, whether that means that Iran is the line that the Chinese will not allow the U.S. to cross or not remains to be seen, but I very much doubt it.
Finally, and I'm grateful for your time, and I apologize in advance if this is in any way a difficult question. What can you tell us about what's going on in the UAE? There are rumors flying that the MBZ, the ruler of the UAE, has been overthrown, that he's even been killed or that he has died, that there is internal rebellion inside the family. If any of those things are true, can you help us understand them and what might be going on?
So I have to say, George, on this one, you probably can find almost anyone who would be a better guest than me. I don't have any insight into that at all. I saw some rumors on Twitter about this, but I've not seen anything that has been confirmed. So I can't speak as to whether that is happening or not. What I can say, however, that if something of that line would happen, it would be a huge development in the region in terms that you are seeing a new constellation being formed in the region. One in which the Saudis are breaking free from the Israeli-Emirati axis, moving closer to Turkey, Egypt, and Qatar. States that increasingly view Israel as the most destabilizing and aggressive and the main threat in the region rather than seeing Iran as such. Do not see a value in that type of an Abraham Accord that the Emiratis signed. And this is also part of the reason why they have been so adamant about preventing war with Iran, not because they have much loss for the Islamic Republic, but because de facto, Iran has become a buffer between them and Israel. And if Iran is defeated or significantly weakened, or if a pro-Israeli puppet is installed in Tehran, then that would be a blow to their geopolitical security and interest in the region, in which they're trying to find some sort of a coalition in order to balance against what they see as an increasingly reckless and unhinged Israeli state allied with the UAE.
Well, Bennett was making similar points in his speech that I saw today. Naftali Bennett. He said that Egypt, Turkey, and Saudi Arabia were becoming a threat to Israel, which would have to be dealt with once the Iranians had been dealt with. That's more or less what you're saying, isn't it?
Yeah, I mean, and I would also say that this is repeating what we saw happen in the early 1990s. Early 1990s, you had Iraq defeated by the United States in a UN coalition. The Soviet Union collapsed. What's interesting there is that those were the two factors that had brought Iran and Israel closer to each other during the time of the Shah, and even during the first decade of the Islamic Revolution, in which the Israelis actually were lobbying for Iran in Washington, D.C. I'm sure you remember the Iran-Contra scandal, in which they wanted to make sure that the U.S. sent weapons to Iran because they were more afraid of Saddam Hussein winning the war. That would be a worse situation from the Israelis. By 1991, those two factors evaporated, and suddenly the Israelis started to see Iran as the threat. And they started to talk about Islamic fundamentalism as the main threat. And they were terrified that the United States and Iran would actually rebuild their relations, and that Israel's strategic value to the United States would be lost in this new post-Cold War world. So what happened late 1991, suddenly you started to see a lot of articles in the Israeli press talking about how Iran is the new threat. We saw the same thing happen after the Turks succeeded in Syria by overthrowing Assad and supporting the HTC. Suddenly, the Israelis started to talk about how Erdogan is the most dangerous person in the Middle East. And that focus started to shift a little bit. They weren't even finished with Iran, but they started to shift it towards Turkey. So it's out there. This is not speculative. The Israelis are openly talking about it. The Arab states and Egypt and Turkey, of course, are listening to this. And as a result, they see that war with Iran is a stepping stone for the Israelis to come after them.
Well, if that doesn't concentrate their mind, I'm not sure anything would. I said finally before, but let me finally ask you, because you're so brilliant, I can hardly bear to let you go. Are there divisions inside the Trump administration on what to do about Iran? I sometimes get the feeling that Vance, for example, isn't all that keen on this course of action.
There are divisions inside the administration, and they always have been on issues of this kind. The divisions appear to look a little bit different from what they did before, however. There are others, not just Vance, that have skepticism, but this is now kept much more quiet than it was back in June. Back in June, you had more leaks about this, there were more open talk about this, and there was a much more open fight within MAGA about this issue than what you have this time around. There is a fight still, but it is much more behind the scenes than it was before for a variety of different reasons. But one thing that seems to be different, not necessarily compared to June, but that is nevertheless different, is that the president himself appears to be a driving force behind this. This is not him being pushed by a bureaucracy or by the Pentagon to go in this direction, but the president himself being on a sugar high from Venezuela, from his previous bombing campaign on Iran, as well as a lot of, in my view, misinformation being fed to him by the Israelis, who tell him that the Iranians are much weaker than others say. All you need to do is push it a little bit. You'll overthrow the regime. You will be the hero. And it seems to me that he's falling for that, whereas other elements in the administration are much more resistant to those type of narratives.